Don't scroll. Listen to this. This story begins at the exact moment when one ordinary evening quietly became unforgettable. Somewhere, someone sat alone in a room filled with silence, believing life would continue exactly as it had the day before. Nothing seemed unusual. The clock ticked softly against the wall. The rain tapped gently on the window. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the table, growing colder with every passing minute. It looked like any other night, yet deep inside, something felt different. It was the kind of feeling you can't explain, the kind that asks you to stop for a moment and pay attention. They tried to ignore it at first. They reached for their phone, turned on the television, and scrolled through endless distractions, hoping the strange feeling would disappear. But it didn't. Instead, it became stronger, quietly pulling their thoughts towards someone they hadn't allowed themselves to think about honestly in a very long time. Listen to this, because every meaningful story has a moment when the heart begins asking questions the mind has spent years trying to avoid. This was that moment. Without fully understanding why, they walked across the room and opened a drawer that had remained closed for years. Inside were ordinary things that most people eventually forget. Old movie tickets, birthday cards, faded photographs, and handwritten notes whose ink had begun to fade. They smiled at a few memories before carefully placing everything back. Then, almost hidden beneath the stack, they found a folded letter they didn't even remember keeping. Their hands hesitated before opening it. It wasn't because they were afraid of what it said. It was because they suddenly realized how much time had passed since they last allowed themselves to revisit that chapter of their life. As they unfolded the paper, every line brought back memories that felt surprisingly alive. They remembered conversations that lasted until sunrise, dreams shared without fear, laughter that made difficult seasons feel lighter, and quiet moments when words were unnecessary because understanding already existed. For years they believed those memories belonged only to the past. Tonight they discovered they had quietly become part of who they were. Your heart needs this right now because this story isn't really about looking backward. It's about recognizing how the moments that shape us continue living inside us long after they seem to be over. As they continued reading, they realized something they had never admitted before. They hadn't forgotten. They had simply become very good at pretending they had. There is a difference. Forgetting happens naturally. Pretending requires constant effort. They had spent years staying busy, filling every empty space with work, responsibilities, routines, and endless distractions because silence always seemed to ask questions they weren't ready to answer. But silence has a way of waiting patiently. Eventually, it always returns. That night, it returned with unusual clarity. They looked out the window as the rain slowly began to stop. Clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky filled with stars that had been hidden only moments before. Something about that simple change felt symbolic. Sometimes clarity arrives exactly the same way. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because the things hiding the truth slowly begin to move aside. Listen to this. Sometimes the biggest change in our lives doesn't begin with a dramatic event. Sometimes it begins with one quiet realization. They closed their eyes and admitted something they had never spoken aloud. Maybe I've been telling myself the wrong story. That sentence echoed through the room. It sounded simple, yet it carried years of emotion behind it. They realized they had built an entire future around assumptions instead of conversations. They had answered questions no one had actually asked. They had convinced themselves that silence meant finality, distance meant indifference, and time meant every meaningful feeling naturally disappeared. Looking back now, none of those beliefs felt as certain as they once had. Instead, they felt like stories created by fear during moments of uncertainty. Your heart needs this right now because every person eventually reaches a point where they must decide whether fear or honesty will write the next chapter. That night, honesty quietly won. They opened a notebook resting beside the lamp and began writing without worrying about perfect words. "I don't know where this road leads," they wrote, "but I know I don't want fear making decisions for me anymore." The sentence surprised them. It was the first completely honest thing they had written in years. More words followed naturally. They wrote about opportunities they never took, conversations they postponed, feelings they carefully buried beneath logic, and the quiet hope they never fully allowed themselves to feel. With every page, the weight inside their heart became lighter. They realized honesty doesn't always change the past. Sometimes it simply changes the person carrying it. Listen to this because the most meaningful journeys often begin with a single truthful sentence. Outside, the first light of dawn slowly appeared along the horizon. Birds began singing while the city quietly woke for another ordinary day. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. They understood that something unexpected had happened, not around them, but within them. The world looked exactly the same, yet they saw it differently. They smiled for reasons they couldn't fully explain. They no longer felt trapped by old assumptions. They felt curious, hopeful, open. They understood that life rarely gives us every answer all at once. Instead, it offers moments of clarity that gently invite us toward deeper understanding. Before closing the notebook, they wrote one final sentence across the bottom of the page: "Whatever comes next, I want it to be guided by truth instead of fear." They stared at those words for several minutes before quietly closing the cover. They believed the night was finally over. They believed the emotional journey had reached its end. But just as they stood to leave the room, their phone lit up with an unexpected notification from someone they hadn't heard from in a very long time. They froze. Their heart began racing. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. They slowly reached for the phone, unaware that the message waiting on the screen would completely change everything they thought they understood and begin a journey they never imagined was still waiting for them. The next morning arrived, but nothing felt the same. The notification was still there, glowing softly on the screen as though it had been waiting for the exact moment they were finally ready to see it. Their heart raced as they reached for the phone, then stopped halfway. They suddenly realized they were afraid, not of the message itself, but of what it might awaken inside them. They had spent so many years carefully building emotional walls that even the possibility of one unexpected conversation felt overwhelming. They took a slow breath, set the phone back on the table, and walked toward the window. Outside, the world continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars moved through quiet streets, people hurried toward work with coffee in their hands, and the morning sun painted everything in soft gold. Yet inside that room, time seemed suspended. Listen to this because every meaningful story has a moment when the heart quietly whispers, "This is where everything changes." They closed their eyes and remembered something an elderly neighbor had once told them years ago: life has a strange way of bringing unfinished chapters back into our hands, not to make us live them again, but to help us understand them differently. At the time those words sounded pleasant but ordinary. This morning they carried an entirely new meaning. They picked up the phone once more. The message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with grand declarations or impossible promises. It simply said, "I hope you're doing well. Something happened recently that made me think about you. If you're ever willing, I'd really like to talk." That was all. Just a few simple sentences. Yet those few sentences somehow carried years of silence between every word. Your heart needs this right now because sometimes it isn't the longest message that changes someone's life. Sometimes it's the simplest one that arrives at exactly the right moment. They stared at the screen for several minutes without replying. Every emotion they thought had settled peacefully inside them suddenly began moving again. They weren't feeling panic. They weren't feeling certainty either. They were feeling possibility. That frightened them more than anything else because possibility requires vulnerability, and vulnerability asks us to step beyond the stories we've repeated for years. Their mind immediately began creating familiar questions. What if this conversation changes nothing? What if too much time has passed? What if they're opening a door that should remain closed? But for the first time, another voice quietly answered those fears. What if you're asking the wrong questions? What if this isn't about changing the past at all? What if it's simply about allowing honesty to exist where silence lived for far too long? Listen to this because growth often begins the moment we stop demanding guarantees before taking one honest step forward. They set the phone aside and made another cup of coffee, hoping the familiar routine would calm their thoughts. Instead, every ordinary action seemed to invite deeper reflection. As the kettle boiled, they remembered mornings from years earlier when conversations flowed naturally without anyone trying to predict where life would lead. They remembered laughing over insignificant things that somehow became unforgettable. They remembered feeling understood without needing to explain every thought. Those memories no longer felt painful. They felt precious. They realized that meaningful moments don't lose their value simply because time passes. They become part of the quiet foundation upon which we continue building our lives. Carrying the coffee to the living room, they opened the notebook they had written in the night before. Reading those pages again, one sentence stood out more clearly than all the others: I want truth to guide whatever comes next. They smiled because life had already begun testing that promise sooner than they expected. Replying would require courage. Ignoring the message would require fear. The choice suddenly seemed much simpler than it had only a few minutes earlier. They weren't deciding the future. They were deciding who they wanted to be while walking toward it. Your heart needs this right now because we cannot always choose what arrives in our lives, but we can choose the spirit with which we respond. They began typing a reply. At first they erased every sentence. Old habits returned, telling them every word had to be perfect. Then they laughed softly at themselves. Perfection had stolen enough moments already. They deleted everything and started over with complete honesty. It's good to hear from you. I'd be willing to talk. Reading those words felt surprisingly peaceful. There were no dramatic promises, no attempts to rewrite history, no expectations about what would happen next. Just openness. Just sincerity. Just one small decision that felt lighter than years of silence. After pressing send, they placed the phone face down and stepped outside for a walk. The air felt fresh after the previous night's rain. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the neighborhood seemed unusually calm. They noticed little things they would once have ignored: a child laughing while riding a bicycle, an older couple sharing breakfast on their porch, birds gathering along a fence before flying together into the bright blue sky. It reminded them that life continues creating beautiful moments even while we're carrying unanswered questions. Perhaps healing wasn't about having every answer. Perhaps healing was learning to appreciate the present without allowing fear to steal it. As they walked, they found themselves smiling for reasons they couldn't fully explain. It wasn't because they knew how the conversation would unfold. It was because they had finally stopped letting imagined outcomes control real decisions. That realization felt like freedom. For years they believed courage meant never feeling afraid. Now they understood courage often means feeling afraid and choosing honesty anyway. Hours passed before the phone vibrated again. This time they didn't hesitate. They picked it up immediately. The new message was short: "Thank you. I wasn't sure you'd answer. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a very long time." Their heartbeat quickened, but instead of anxiety they felt calm curiosity. Whatever those words turned out to be, they knew one thing had already changed forever. They were no longer the person who allowed fear to write every ending before the story had a chance to continue. And as they looked at the message one more time, another notification appeared beneath it, one unexpected sentence that made them stop breathing for just a second, because it hinted that the conversation about to begin wasn't only about the past. It was about a truth neither of them had fully understood until now. Listen to this, because this is where the story quietly changes forever. After reading those words on the screen, they didn't answer immediately. Instead, they placed the phone on the table and simply sat there, allowing the silence to settle around them. For years, silence had always felt heavy, filled with unanswered questions and assumptions that seemed impossible to escape. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It felt like the calm that arrives just before a long-awaited conversation finally begins. They looked out the window as sunlight slowly faded into the warm colors of late afternoon, realizing that life often gives us unexpected opportunities when we've finally stopped demanding that everything happen according to our own timeline. They remembered all the years they had spent convincing themselves that certain chapters of life were permanently closed. They had repeated the same story so many times that it became familiar, almost comfortable. They told themselves that people move on, memories fade, and unanswered questions eventually disappear on their own. Yet sitting there with the phone resting beside them, they realized none of those things had happened the way they imagined. The memories had not disappeared. They had simply become quieter. The questions had not vanished. They had patiently waited until they were finally ready to ask them honestly. And the person they believed had become nothing more than part of their past had unexpectedly become part of their present once again. Your heart needs this right now, because sometimes life doesn't return us to old memories so we can relive them, it returns us to them so we can finally understand them. They picked up the phone once more and slowly typed another message. This time there was no hesitation. "Whenever you're ready, I'm willing to listen." After pressing send, they set the phone aside without staring at it. That small decision surprised them. In the past they would have watched every second pass, wondering whether a reply would come. Now they felt peaceful. They had done the only thing they truly controlled, they had answered with honesty. Whatever happened next no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to time. As evening settled over the neighborhood, they decided to take another walk. The air carried the fresh scent left behind by yesterday's rain, and the streets were filled with ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. A father taught his daughter how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. An elderly couple laughed together while walking their dog. Someone played soft music from an open apartment window. They realized that life had quietly continued creating beautiful moments even while they spent years believing everything meaningful had been left behind. That realization made them smile. Perhaps happiness had never disappeared. Perhaps they had simply been looking in the wrong direction. Listen to this, because healing often begins the moment we stop chasing certainty and start appreciating what is already in front of us. When they returned home, the phone vibrated again. This time the message was longer. "Thank you for answering. I've started writing this message so many times over the years that I honestly lost count. Every version sounded wrong because I kept trying to explain everything perfectly. The truth is much simpler than that. Something happened recently that made me realize how quickly life changes. It reminded me that waiting forever isn't really a plan. I don't expect anything from this conversation. I just didn't want another year to pass without telling you something I should have said a long time ago. They read the message twice before putting the phone down. There were no dramatic declarations. No impossible promises. Just honesty. And somehow honesty carried more emotional weight than any perfect speech ever could. They thought about how many people spend years rehearsing conversations that never happen because they believe every word must be flawless before it's spoken. Yet the most meaningful conversations are rarely perfect. They're simply genuine. That realization stayed with them long after the message had been read. They walked to the bookshelf and pulled out an old journal they hadn't opened in years. Inside were dreams, plans, and handwritten thoughts from a much younger version of themselves. One sentence immediately caught their attention: "I hope one day I become brave enough to stop wondering and start living honestly." Reading those words brought an unexpected laugh. They realized the person who wrote that sentence had no idea how long the journey toward that courage would actually be. Yet somehow, after all this time, they had finally arrived there. They no longer wanted to protect themselves by expecting disappointment before it happened. They wanted to experience life without constantly predicting the ending. Your heart needs this right now because the strongest version of ourselves is often the one willing to admit, "I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready to face it honestly." That night they slept more peacefully than they had in years. Not because every question had been answered, but because they had finally stopped running from them. The next morning brought another message with a simple invitation: "Would you be willing to meet for coffee this weekend?" They stared at those words, feeling their heartbeat quicken. For a brief moment the familiar voice of fear tried to return, reminding them of every possible disappointment. But another voice, calmer and wiser, quietly answered back. "You've already survived uncertainty before. This time, choose courage." They smiled, typed a single word, "Yes," and pressed send. As soon as the message was delivered, they looked out at the morning sky, realizing something remarkable. The biggest change hadn't been receiving an unexpected message. It hadn't even been agreeing to meet. The biggest change was that they were no longer the person who believed fear deserved the final word. Whatever happened at that meeting would become part of their story, but for the first time they understood something that had taken years to learn: peace doesn't come from knowing exactly how every chapter ends. Peace comes from having the courage to keep turning the pages. And just as they closed the journal and prepared to begin the day, one final notification appeared on their phone, one sentence so unexpected that it made them stop in the middle of the room, because it revealed there was one truth neither of them had ever spoken aloud, and everything they believed about their shared past was about to be seen through an entirely different light. Listen to this, because this is the moment when everything they believed about the past began to change. They stood perfectly still, staring at the newest message on their phone, reading it once, then twice, then a third time just to make sure they hadn't misunderstood it. The words were simple: "There's something I never told you because I thought it was already too late." That single sentence carried more weight than they could explain. For years they had imagined hundreds of possible conversations, countless explanations, and endless endings, yet none of them had prepared them for something so honest. They placed the phone down and took a slow breath, feeling their heart beat faster than it had in years. Not because they suddenly knew what would happen next, but because they realized they no longer needed to. The need to control every outcome had quietly disappeared, replaced by something much gentler: curiosity. They remembered the person they used to be, someone who would have immediately imagined the worst possible ending, someone who believed silence always meant rejection and unanswered questions always meant the story was over. Looking back now, they almost smiled at how much fear had influenced their decisions without them even realizing it. They had spent years trying to protect themselves from disappointment, yet in doing so they had also protected themselves from hope. That realization felt strangely liberating. They walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter while looking out the window. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the quiet neighborhood, children laughed somewhere in the distance, and a gentle breeze moved the leaves outside. Everything looked peaceful, almost as if the world was reminding them that not every important moment arrives with dramatic music or extraordinary signs. Sometimes life changes quietly, one honest sentence at a time. Your heart needs this right now because the biggest turning points rarely announce themselves, they simply arrive when we're finally ready to receive them. They picked up the phone again and typed, "Whenever you're ready, I'll listen." They pressed send before fear could rewrite the message. Seconds later came the reply, "Thank you. I honestly didn't think you would." Reading those words made them pause. How many years had both of them spent assuming they already knew what the other person would say? How many opportunities had quietly disappeared because both were afraid of hearing an answer they weren't prepared for? They realized something profound in that moment. Fear doesn't always shout. Most of the time it whispers. It quietly convinces us not to call, not to ask, not to explain, not to apologize, not to risk being vulnerable. Then, after enough time passes, it tells us the silence proves we were right all along. They understood now that fear had been telling that story for years. But today, honesty interrupted it. That evening they received another message with a place and time to meet. It was a small coffee shop neither of them had visited in years. They looked at the address and immediately smiled. It wasn't chosen because it was impressive. It was chosen because it was familiar. It reminded them that some places quietly preserve pieces of our lives long after we've stopped visiting them. Saturday arrived sooner than expected. As they drove toward the cafe, countless thoughts crossed their mind, but something was different this time. They weren't rehearsing speeches or imagining perfect outcomes. They simply wanted to be present. They parked across the street a few minutes early and remained inside the car, watching people come and go. Friends greeted each other with hugs, families laughed over breakfast, strangers held doors open for one another. Life continued moving naturally around them. Somehow that ordinary scene calmed every anxious thought. They stepped out, crossed the street, and opened the cafe door. The familiar smell of fresh coffee instantly brought back memories they hadn't thought about in years. They looked around the room until their eyes finally met someone already waiting near the window. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Neither smiled immediately. Neither spoke. Time seemed to pause as they simply looked at one another, recognizing not only the person standing before them but also the years that had quietly changed them both. Then, almost at the same time, they laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because the awkwardness they had feared suddenly disappeared. They sat down, and for several moments neither knew where to begin. Finally, the other person spoke first. "I've replayed this conversation in my mind so many times that now I don't know what to say." Hearing those words somehow made everything easier. They smiled and answered honestly. "Me too." That single exchange broke years of tension. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't filled with impossible declarations. It was real. They spoke about life, family, work, dreams that changed, mistakes they had made, and lessons they had learned. There were moments of silence, but those silences no longer felt uncomfortable. They felt peaceful because neither person was pretending anymore. Eventually the conversation reached the question both had quietly avoided for years. Why didn't you ever say anything? There was no defensiveness in the room, only genuine curiosity. After a long pause came the answer. Because I thought you had already made your choice, and I didn't want to make your life harder. Those words settled over the table like morning light. For years both had believed they were protecting each other. Instead, they had been protecting themselves from uncertainty. They both laughed gently at the realization, amazed by how many years had been shaped by assumptions neither of them had ever questioned. Your heart needs this right now because sometimes the greatest misunderstandings aren't created by a lack of caring, they're created by two people trying so hard not to cause pain that they never tell each other the truth. Hours passed without either of them noticing. The coffee had long since gone cold, yet neither wanted the conversation to end. As they stood outside preparing to leave, the afternoon sun slowly began sinking toward the horizon. There was still so much left unsaid, but for the first time that no longer felt frightening. They knew another conversation would come. They knew honesty had finally replaced silence. Just before saying goodbye, the other person reached into their bag and carefully placed a small folded envelope into their hand. I almost threw this away years ago, they said quietly. But something told me to keep it. Confused, they looked down at the envelope. Their name was written across the front in handwriting they recognized instantly. Their heart began racing once again, because somehow they already knew this wasn't an ordinary letter. Whatever was written inside had been waiting for years to be read, and they sensed that opening it would reveal the one truth both of them had carried silently for far too long. Listen to this because this is the moment when the truth can no longer remain hidden. They stood outside the coffee shop for several seconds, holding the small envelope in their hands as though it contained something far more valuable than paper and ink. The world around them continued exactly as it always had. Cars rolled past. People laughed as they crossed the street. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh rain through the afternoon air. Yet none of it seemed to matter anymore. Their attention was completely fixed on the neatly folded envelope with their name written across the front. It looked ordinary, almost forgotten by time, but somehow it carried the weight of years. They looked up, wanting to ask a dozen questions at once, but the other person simply smiled with quiet nervousness. I wrote that a long time ago, they admitted. I never had the courage to give it to you. Every year I told myself it was too late. Then I almost threw it away more times than I can count. But every time I picked it up, something inside me said, not yet. I don't know why I kept it. I just did. Those words settled into the silence between them. There was no dramatic music, no impossible coincidence, no perfect speech. Just two people standing on a sidewalk, finally choosing honesty over assumptions. Your heart needs this right now because the biggest moments in life often arrive looking completely ordinary. They slipped the envelope carefully into their jacket pocket without opening it immediately. I'd rather read it when I have time to understand every word, they said softly. The other person nodded with visible relief. That's all I hoped for. They walked together for a few minutes before reaching the corner where their paths separated. There was no awkwardness anymore. Instead, there was a quiet peace neither of them had expected. They said goodbye with the promise of talking again soon, and for the first time that promise didn't feel uncertain. It felt genuine. During the drive home, they kept touching the pocket where the envelope rested, almost to reassure themselves it was still there. They weren't rushing to open it because they realized something important. Some moments deserve to be experienced slowly. For years they had hurried toward conclusions without allowing life to unfold naturally. Today felt different. Today they wanted to appreciate every step of the journey. As evening settled over the neighborhood, they returned home, placed the envelope on the kitchen table, and made themselves a cup of coffee. The house was completely silent except for the faint sound of the clock on the wall. They sat down, took one long breath, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in slightly faded blue ink. The handwriting was unmistakable. They unfolded the pages with trembling hands and began reading. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," the first line began. "Maybe this letter will stay hidden forever. Maybe I'll lose the courage to give it to you. But I realized there were things I needed to say, even if the only person who ever reads these words is me." They stopped for a moment, already feeling emotion rise inside them. The letter continued. "For a long time I convinced myself silence was the kindest choice. I thought speaking honestly would only complicate your life. I believed that if something was truly meant to happen, it wouldn't require difficult conversations. Looking back now, I realize how wrong I was. Silence didn't protect anyone. It only created questions neither of us ever answered." They continued reading. Every paragraph felt deeply personal, not because it contained dramatic declarations, but because it contained ordinary truths. The writer admitted moments of fear, hesitation, and regret. They described all the times they almost reached out but stopped themselves at the last second. They remembered birthdays when they wondered how life was going on the other side of the silence, holidays when familiar memories unexpectedly returned, and random afternoons when an old song made them smile before reminding them of everything left unsaid. They confessed that they had never expected life to pause, nor had they expected anyone to wait. They simply wished they had been brave enough to say thank you for everything that connection had taught them before allowing fear to convince them the opportunity had disappeared forever. As they reached the middle of the letter, one sentence made them stop reading completely. "The greatest mistake I ever made wasn't losing touch. It was believing I already knew how your story ended without giving you the chance to tell it yourself." They closed their eyes, letting those words settle into their heart. They realized they had made the very same mistake. For years both of them had quietly written endings for a story neither had actually finished reading. Neither person had intended to cause pain. Neither had stopped caring overnight. They had simply allowed uncertainty to speak louder than honesty. Your heart needs this right now because understanding often begins the moment we stop trying to decide who was right and instead ask what everyone was afraid of. They finished the final page. The closing paragraph was simple. "If our paths never cross again after this, I still wanted you to know one thing. Meeting you changed me for the better. It taught me to be kinder, more patient, and more grateful for genuine connections. No matter where life takes either of us, I'm thankful our paths crossed at all. There was no request. No expectation. No pressure. Just gratitude." Tears quietly formed in their eyes, not because the letter promised a perfect future, but because it finally gave words to years of silence. They folded the pages carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Looking around the quiet room, they realized they felt lighter than they had in years. The unanswered questions that once haunted them had begun transforming into understanding. They weren't pretending every problem had disappeared. They simply recognized that honest conversations, even delayed ones, carry a remarkable ability to heal misunderstandings that silence only deepens. They walked outside onto the porch as the first stars appeared overhead. The evening air felt calm, and for the first time in a long while they weren't wondering what they should have done years ago. They were thinking about tomorrow. Not with fear. Not with expectations. With hope. They understood that whatever happened next would be built on something entirely different than before. No more imagined endings. No more assumptions quietly filling empty spaces. Only truth, spoken with kindness, one conversation at a time. Just as they were about to return inside, their phone buzzed once again. It was a new message. Only 7 words appeared on the screen. There's still one thing you don't know yet. They stared at those words, their heartbeat quickening once again, realizing that the letter had answered many questions, but the biggest revelation of all was still waiting to be discovered.